Hi there, and welcome to this video on GCSE Biology for the AQA Specification, focusing on the topic of adaptations, interdependence and competition, and in particular having a look at communities. I'm Shumina from StudyMind, where we help you revise GCSE Biology with our helpful video tutorials, tailored to your subject, your specification, and to you. If you're new here, make sure you click the subscribe button. Whilst you are watching, please leave any comments below if you're unsure about anything, and let us know if it's your first time watching our videos so we can send you our free revision materials. We also have helpful timestamps below for each part of the video to help guide you through the specification. So let's get started. Hello, and welcome to this tutorial on communities. So in this tutorial, we're going to be having a look at some basic definitions. We're then going to have a look at organisation within an ecosystem. And finally, we're going to take a look at interdependence and competition. So students should be able to describe different levels of organisation in an ecosystem, from individual organisms to the whole ecosystem. So this is really the basis of this tutorial. So do go through these individual points and make sure that you understand what is going on by the end of the tutorial. So first of all, some basic definitions. So biodiversity is a measure of the variety of living organisms within a particular habitat, ecosystem, biome, or all over Earth. So note that there are some words that are in bold, and that's because it's really important that you use this scientific terminology in your answer, because this could be a really simple 1 or 2 marker that you get in your exam, just a really simple definition that you just need to learn and be able to reiterate back in the exam. So perhaps make note cards, flashcards, that kind of thing, and practice these definitions so that you get these really easy marks. So another one is habitat. So a habitat is an area where one or more organisms live. So for example, a fish could have a pond as its habitat. A population is all of the organisms of the same species in a certain area. Okay, so note that there's some really important terms in this definition. So the organisms have to be of the same species. So we're looking at the number of organisms of the same species, so not of different species. So, for example, here there are 4 organisms in this fish population, okay, and they are all in the same species. Now, to take into account different species, we use the word community, because a community refers to all of the populations present inside a single habitat. So do you get that difference? So a population, if we go back to the last slide, is all of the organisms of the same species. Community is all of the populations, so all of the organisms of different species, so all of the populations present inside a single habitat. So for example, a pond will not only have those fish that we saw in the previous slide, but there'll be birds, frogs, insects, okay? So that's our community living in our single habitat. And an ecosystem takes into account everything in this habitat. So it's the interaction of the community with all of the abiotic and biotic features in the environment, so the living and non-living features of the environment. And as I just defined for you, so the abiotic factors are non-living factors, and biotic factors are living factors. So a rock would be abiotic, but a pelican is a biotic factor. So in terms of our ecosystem, we have our abiotic factors, such as our rocks, and our biotic factors, such as our community of varying populations. Right, so next slide. So we have organisation within an ecosystem, okay? So going from kind of the smallest up here downwards, we get larger and larger kind of numbers and mass. So we have our organism, many of which form our population, many of which form our community, many of which form our ecosystem, many of which form our biome, and onto our biosphere. So I think this kind of just shows really nicely the meaning of the different definitions in context. So this could really help, perhaps if you draw this alongside your definitions in your notes. Now, there is a food chain in ecosystems, and this consists of our producers at the bottom. Now, they get eaten by our primary consumers, which get eaten by the secondary consumers, which get eaten by the tertiary consumers. So again, there's a really nice little hierarchy. And these are known as trophic levels. And this will be covered in a lot more detail in a later tutorial, so don't worry right now if I've kind of skimmed over that, but just for you to know, there is a food chain within the ecosystems that we look at. Now, producers provide energy to the ecosystem by photosynthesizing to produce food. So producers might include algae and plants in general. Primary consumers are herbivores. So a herbivore is something that feeds on the producer. So it's eating greens, it's eating plants, it's eating things that photosynthesize, as opposed to eating meat, which we would call a carnivore, as we'll see on the next few slides. So our primary consumers are herbivores. They only eat plants, and examples include deer and cows. Now, secondary consumers get their energy from primary consumers, and we refer to them as carnivores because they are eating consumers, they're eating meat, I guess. And these types of organisms eat only animals, and it's the same with tertiary consumers, they're also carnivores. And tertiary consumers are at the apex of our food chain, so they're right at the top. Now, as I said, we will be looking at food chains in much more detail in a tutorial that's coming up a little bit later, so stay tuned for that. Now, this concept of interdependence, so ecosystems are very intricately linked, and each organism is inextricably linked to one another. So that means that they're interdependent on each other. So if one relationship fails, the whole food chain can fail. So, for example, if there isn't enough grass for worms in this little diagram at the bottom, then the worms won't be able to reproduce, meaning that there's then less worms for the birds to eat and fewer birds for the snakes to eat. Okay, so can you see here how if there is a lack of the producer, so our grass, then there won't be enough of the population of worms to be sustained by the smaller amount of grass. So we're going to have fewer primary consumers and hence fewer secondary and tertiary consumers. So they are all interdependent on each other because they rely on each other in order to survive and successfully reproduce and sustain their populations. So here's another example. So try and, before I go into detail of what this slide is explaining, try and label which one is the producer, which one is the primary consumer, and which one is the secondary consumer, and come up with a reasoning why in your head, and we'll go through it. So I'll just give you a few seconds to do that. Okie dokie, so your producer will be right at the start of the food chain, so really simple, okay? Always right at the start of the food chain. So this is our apple, our plant. Our primary consumer follows our producer, and our secondary consumer consumes the primary consumer, so hence it's the secondary consumer, and that comes third in the food chain. Okay, so that was a really simple little labelling exercise there, just to familiarise yourself with food chains. Now, if there's a shortage of fruits one year, the bats will starve and so die, and in turn the eagles will starve and die because they lose their prey. So can you see how if one species is removed, the whole ecosystem suffers because we have this interdependence. We rely on the apples to sustain the bat population to then sustain the eagle population, okay? So competition occurs usually at the same trophic level because organisms at the same trophic level are usually competing for the same kind of things. So for example, plants are producers, right? So they're on the first trophic level, right at the bottom of the food chain, or right at the start of the food chain. And plants compete with other plants for nutrients, space, light, water and minerals at the producer level. whereas a primary consumer perhaps wouldn't be competing for exactly the same requirements that a plant would need, right? So like, a bat, as we saw in the previous slide, wouldn't be competing for the same resources that the apple needs. So the bats might be competing for territory, mates and food. So can you see in this way how competition occurs at the same trophic level as opposed to between trophic levels? Usually. That's usually the case. So this is just a little diagrammatic explanation here. So we might have animals competing for territory. So we have the elephants and the giraffes competing for land. And the giraffes may be more successful than the elephants. So we have this element of competition within the same trophic level, because these two species of animal would be on the same trophic level. Now, why is it that the giraffes won in that situation? Well, it's really likely that the giraffes must have some kind of better adaptation, and therefore they were able to outcompete the elephants, survive, and ultimately have more offspring, and therefore their population grows. So competition can come from within a species or from different species, and it all depends on whether the resources required are from one species or another. Now, in stable ecosystems, the size of the community stays constant at all times. So this occurs in the ecosystem of the fruits, bats and eagles. And in such ecosystems, even the environmental factors such as light and minerals are balanced. So the aim is to maintain a stable ecosystem. And this explains why human factors can cause so much harm to ecosystems. So deforestation, for example, changes these environmental factors. It then introduces elements of competition to the ecosystem, and therefore it changes the balance that these organisms have maintained with each other. So now let's have a look at some practice questions. So I want you to read each of these statements that are going to come up and have a look at which ones are true or false, okay? And come up with a reasoning why as well. So a community is made up of a single species of animal or plant. B, a population is the number of a single species living in a habitat. C, abiotic factors are living. One example is predators. And D, in a stable environment, we would expect the abiotic factors to be constant. So perhaps pause the video here and we'll go through the answers in a short while. So A, a community is made up of a single species of animal or plant. Well, this is going to be false because we have learned on a previous slide that a community is made up of multiple species of animals or plants. It's made up of multiple populations, so that would be false. B, a population is the number of a single species living in a habitat. That is correct. So that is the correct definition of a population. So can you see here why just learning your definitions is going to give you easy marks, okay? So make sure you commit those to memory. Abiotic factors are living. One example is predators. So that's a big no-no. We know that biotic factors are living. Abiotic factors are non-living things. So if we removed the A part of the word abiotic, then this sentence would be true. But because it's talking about abiotic factors, that's not true. An abiotic factor would be a rock, as we saw on a previous slide. And lastly, in a stable environment, we would expect the abiotic factors to be constant. Yes, we would. So that is all for today. That's all our specification points covered. There's quite a bit of dense stuff in this tutorial in terms of definitions. So read through the spec, read through the slides, make some notes, put some stuff in diagrammatic format to make things easier for you. And apart from that, I think if you go through this tutorial at least a couple of times, you will be completely fine with the questions that get thrown at you in the exam. So well done for today, and I'll see you for the next session.
Thanks for watching this free video from StudyMind. If you liked this video, make sure to subscribe to catch our newest videos by clicking below, and leave a comment on a topic you'd like a video on. Click here to watch more videos in our series for GCSE Biology, or visit our website studymind.co.uk for free past paper compilations by topic and specification.